The next member of Team Seraph is finally ready to be revealed. Standing alongside Seraphina Vermilion, this character is Sarah's partner. Thank you so much to everyone who left such kind comments on the video introducing Sarah to this YouTube channel. It really means so much to me that you all love her character, and I really hope you'll all come to love this character as well. So allow me to introduce to you all Zelena Ray, a 22-year-old huntress hailing from Mistral. She may appear human, but she is in fact a Faunus. A fact that the people of Mistral did not take very kindly to, that someone would appear human while being a Faunus, not to mention her Faunus trait isn't one that many found very appealing. She is a snake Faunus, and her Faunus trait is her snake tongue. To be specific, she is a species of pit viper, but still a snake tongue isn't something that many would find all that appealing. Now, both of these artworks of Sarah and of Zelena were drawn by Hoshi Ojo. Link in the description below to her DeviantArt page as well as her YouTube channel, where she posts speed paints of a lot of the artwork that she does, including the artwork that I've commissioned from her. So if you guys want to check that out and see how these characters were brought to life, I highly encourage you to do so, to see all the artwork that she's done in the past and will do in the future, as she's currently working on the other members of Team Seraph as well. Now, in accordance with the color naming rule, Zelena is the literal translation of the word green in various languages, Slovak being one of them, and references Zelena's color inspiration being royal green. Her last name, Ray, alludes to the rays of the sun, bringing to mind a yellow color, but also in Old English, Ray means wise protector, alluding to the character inspiration for Zelena. Now, upon hearing the names Seraphina and Team Seraph, a few people were thinking that maybe all of Team Seraph had angelic inspirations. And although there are angelic inspirations in Team Seraph and Seraphina's character, a majority of the inspirations for every member of Team Seraph comes from Greek mythology. Seraphina is inspired by the myth of Icarus, and some of you may already be able to guess the myth that inspired Zelena's character. She is based on the Greek myth of Medusa, the monstrous gorgon that had snakes for hair, and upon locking eyes with her, you were turned to stone. Gorgons in Greek mythology are seen as a sign of protection. In Medusa's myth, after her head was cut off by Perseus, it was used as a method of defense, later to be put into a shield that became a symbol of protection. So Zelena Ray's name, meaning green wise protector, alludes to the color of Medusa herself and the fact that gorgons are seen as a sign of protection. But that doesn't end the allusions to Medusa and gorgons in Zelena's character design. Her personal emblem, designed by Matt33OC, references the Gorgon's eye, the ability that Gorgons had to turn someone to stone by making eye contact with them, as well as her weapons being a reference to Medusa's sisters. For those of you who don't know, Medusa actually had two sisters that were also Gorgons, Stheno and Euryale, and these are represented by Zelena's weapons. Twin Serpent Dust whips. On her right is Stheno, the red whip imbued with fire dust with white crystal eyes that are wind dust crystals, giving her the ability to use fire and wind dust. And on her left is Euryale, a blue whip imbued with ice dust, with yellow crystal eyes being lightning dust crystals. So overall, Zelena has the ability to use fire, wind, ice, and lightning dust at will in combat. She's very much a support member of Team Seraph, focusing on ranged combat and supporting her allies with dust rather than close combat, as growing up in Mistral, she didn't really have any combat experience before going to the combat schools, so technically she's the physically weakest member of Team Seraph, not being skilled at close combat, but still a very crucial member of the team nonetheless. And the allusions to Medusa don't end there, as her semblance also alludes to the Gorgons. Her semblance is named Nightmare Gaze, and it is a hallucination-style semblance, kind of maybe similar to Emerald's in some ways, but also very different. Her semblance, she doesn't have control over what it is exactly that a person hallucinates. When she focuses on a single target and makes eye contact with them, their deepest nightmares of their souls are brought to life before them. She can only use her semblance on a single target at a time, unlike Emerald, where it causes great strain, but she can use it on multiple targets. Zelena has to focus on one. She makes eye contact with a single target and has to remain focused on that target for the semblance to continue being active. It does drain her aura pretty decently, but still, the nightmares that are brought forth from the deepest depths of a person's soul can traumatize a person. This is a semblance that Zelena does not like, and has caused her much pain in her past, as it is just one more thing that causes people to hate her. Being able to bring other people's nightmares to life is something that she is terrified of doing, of losing the people that she is close to because they become afraid of her. This semblance, combined with her Faunus trait, has left a lot of scars in her past, but thanks to the rest of her team, those scars have been able to heal. Zelena, as I mentioned before, was raised in Mistral, where people were not kind to Faunus, and the human children in particular were very unkind to other Faunus children. And they singled out Zelena in particular because she appeared human, if not for her snake tongue flicking out every once in a while whenever she would get excited or just based on reflex. So they would constantly berate her throughout her entire childhood. She always heard things like, "Ew, does she shed her skin too? Careful, don't get too close or she'll swallow us whole." Things like that she heard all the time, and eventually she just became numb to it all, just brushing it off and ignoring it. She did find some solace, though, as she found her escape in books, learning about the history and the diversity of the world, different kingdoms, and all of the other stories that were around it. But in particular, her favorite stories were about huntsmen and huntresses, the heroism that they displayed defending the people against the monsters that plagued the world. But it wasn't necessarily the heroism that was her favorite part about the stories. It was the freedom that the huntsmen and huntresses had. The ability to go to any kingdom that they wanted to. If there was ever a place that they didn't like, they could easily leave and escape however they wanted. Not to mention, it was also kind of nice that the stories, if there was anyone who spoke out against the huntress, hated the huntsman and everything like that, they always ended up quickly changing their tune when the monsters attacked and the huntsmen were the only ones able to defend them. After displaying their skills, of course, people tend to change their tune a little bit. Zelena was smart enough to realize, though, that the real world was probably very different. There were some that, if they hated the huntsman or huntress, no matter how many times they were saved by one of them, they would still carry that hatred onwards. Much like in Mistral, however much a Faunus contributed to the community, there was still a natural dislike for them. But Zelena didn't care. She liked the freedom that the huntsmen and huntresses had, and these stories gave her hope that that might be possible for her. They were her solace. And she did have a couple people that she could share these with. Her neighbors, a brother and sister pair who were older than her by 5 and 3 years respectively, that they were more friends by circumstance, being raised as Faunus in this little area of Mistral and having to deal with everything of the discrimination, etc. And she liked hanging around with them. They would listen to her stories and to the tales that she would tell of the stories that she read in her books, and also, having them around, the bullies would tend to leave her alone, as hanging around big kids, well, the bullies didn't want to bat above their weight class, so to say. One day, though, everything changed for Zelena, as she was out reading one of her favorite stories in a park near her home that she often frequented, as, you know, her home was good enough for reading, but she always loved reading her favorite stories while under the warmth of the sun. She was very immersed in this one, as the hero had his back against the wall with a group of Beowulfs closing in, that she didn't realize that a similar situation was happening to her at that moment. The bullies had shown up at the park and were drawing nearer. Normally, whenever the bullies would show up, they would just yell their slurs at Zelena, and she would simply pack up her books, ignore them, and just walk on home. The bullies, feeling that their mission was accomplished after driving Zelena away, would leave it at that, and nothing more would come of it. However, today, the bullies were particularly aggressive. The lead bully especially. Whether it was from something that happened at home, whether he got in trouble for something else, etc., Zelena still doesn't know to this day. However, this was the first time that they got physical with her. They showed up, and just as Zelena was preparing to leave, seeing them coming, she closed her book, got up, and they blocked her path, pushing her down and taking her book. This was the first time they got physical, and Zelena started to become a little bit scared, not knowing what to do. She looked to where her friends had lived, but they were out helping their parents, and they weren't going to come to her rescue. Upon seeing what this book was, the bullies started laughing, saying, "Oh, this is rich. You want to become a huntress? You couldn't even fight a baby, let alone a Grimm." Actually, you know what? I take that back. With your disgusting snake tongue, I'm sure you'd be enough to scare the Grimm away, so maybe this would be the perfect position for you. At this comment, the fear that Zelena had started to feel was overshadowed by her anger. Her snake tongue was one thing. This was something she was born with. She couldn't change it, but being a huntress was her dream. This was something that she chose. She idolized the stories in this book and wanted to be like those heroes, and these idiots were trampling all over it. So she stood up, tried to hide her anger, and asked as politely as she could for them to return the book to her. Of course, they refused, so she decided to be a little bit more aggressive this time, reaching for the book instead and asking once again for them to return it. They didn't take very kindly to this and pushed her away again, this time a little bit harder. And as she hit the ground, facing it, and started to push her way up, she heard the tearing of paper. "Oops, my hand slipped. I guess you shouldn't have tried to reach for it. This is your fault, you know." And at this, her anger erupted. She knew she couldn't fight against these bullies. They not only outnumbered her, but they were larger than her, a year older, and still she wanted to get some revenge. She turned and glared at them, wishing that they would feel some semblance of fear that she had felt growing up. The endless torment that they had put her under for years. She just wished for a moment that they would feel something akin to that. Upon seeing that Zelena was furious, the bullies started laughing hysterically. The lead bully turned to his friends, "Oh look, I think I made it angry." But then upon turning back to look at Zelena, he caught her eye. And as Zelena was staring intently back at him, she saw that happy expression of laughter fade from his face, replacing it a look of sheer terror as the color started to drain from his skin. He fell backwards, tears starting to well up in his eyes, and he screamed, trying to get away, clambering backwards, and Zelena started blinking, confused as to what happened, but at the time the bully dropped the book, so she reached up, grabbed it, and looked at the bully confused. Her anger was gone at this point, but she was just wondering what the hell happened. As the bully started to snap out of it and realized that he was back in the real world, he looked around, looked at Zelena, and screamed, "You monster! You monster!" and ran. At seeing this, the other bullies that were following his lead looked at him running away, looked at Zelena, and ran away along with him. Zelena had no idea what had just happened, but the bullies were gone, the day was still young, and she had her favorite book back. There was some pages torn, but she had her book back and she could enjoy the rest of the day reading her stories. So she did. This was the first day in a very long time where she read her stories unbothered. And as she returned to her home late at night, her parents, mother and father, were a bit concerned that Zelena had been out all day, wondering what happened, if something had happened to her. But Zelena proudly exclaimed, "No, nothing's wrong. In fact, I stood up to the bullies today, and they left me alone, surprisingly enough. So honestly, everything couldn't be better." And it remained that way for the next couple days. Zelena was able to go to the park, the bullies never came back to her surprise, and she was able to immerse herself in her stories. But after a little while, she realized that no one was coming near her anymore. When she saw her two friends, her two acquaintances, her neighbors, she ran up to them saying, hey, I stood up to the bullies. I got rid of them, and tried to exclaim everything that happened, and her friends were visibly afraid of her. She didn't realize what she did, but they told her what they had heard from the boy's parents, that Zelena had terrified him, so much so that he was traumatized. He didn't leave his room for 2 days, barely ate or slept, and was only just coming out of this trauma that he had experienced. Her friends were now afraid of her. Their parents had advised them not to go anywhere near Zelena, and she was shocked by this. She didn't know what to expect, and as she was walking on her way home, she started becoming aware of the glances that people were giving her, that they were fearful, that they were whispering to each other, and she was afraid. She didn't know what was happening. Tears started welling up in her eyes, and she ran home to her room. And as she was crying, realizing that the only friends that she had had up to that point now hated her, now were afraid of her, she made a realization. She remembered something about those stories that she had read, that each of these heroes had a certain special ability. She picked up the book and flipped through a couple of pages and whispered to herself, "Semblance." She realized that this must have been what it was, that her ability must have awakened, that every living being with a soul also possesses this ability, and hers made people afraid of her. She started becoming angry at herself, hating herself that her soul would manifest such a power. Why was she cursed with such an ability to make anyone that she cared about hate her, become afraid of her? She stood up and looked at herself in the mirror, and as she looked at herself, she became increasingly angry, disgusted with herself, that this was the person that made everyone around her fearful. And as soon as this thought so much as passed her mind, her semblance activated again, this time towards her own reflection, and Zelena was looking directly into her own eyes. At that point, the world faded away to black, and all that she could see were images of her parents, of everyone that she knew, yelling at her, hating her, yelling slurs that they couldn't stand that someone like her existed, and she was afraid. She didn't know what she did or how to solve this. She didn't know what was happening to her, and she fell backwards, tears welling up in her eyes and started streaming down her face. As she had fallen backwards, she made a thud on the floor, and her mother ran up to see what was happening. Upon entering the room, she saw Zelena, eyes glowing, staring at herself in the mirror, unable to break her own gaze. At that point, her mother didn't know exactly what was happening, but stepped in front of Zelena and held her close, breaking the spell that she had put on herself. And Zelena, upon coming to, realized that her mother was there, and said, Mom, please don't hate me. I'm sorry. And they stayed like that for a matter of a few hours. It felt like an eternity that Zelena's mother just stayed and held her in her arms. After explaining what had happened, her parents weren't angry. They were, in fact, proud that Zelena stood up to the bullies. It wasn't her fault that her semblance awakened the way it did. She didn't have any control over her power, but this was something that they were going to work on together, so Zelena could start to understand her power and understand what was happening. Her parents had heard some stories and some rumors about a child that was causing people to be fearful, but they didn't expect that it was their daughter. They still loved her nonetheless, didn't blame her for what happened, and tried to explain to everyone in the town what exactly was going on. Unfortunately, the people of Mistral were not so willing to listen to the defenses of a Faunus girl that was traumatizing human children. They saw her as a monster, though they would never say it to her face for fear of incurring their own worst nightmare. But Zelena was well aware of what they thought. She became acutely aware of the looks that people would give her, their eyes shifting back and forth, avoiding making eye contact with her, and the whispers that they would spread behind her back. Everyone ostracized Zelena, and her family on top of that, and Zelena blamed herself for it, seeing herself as a monster as well. She hated her semblance already, but started hating the fact that she ever stood up to the bullies in the first place, because if she didn't, none of this would have happened. But she also still clung to her dream of becoming a huntress, immersing herself even deeper into those stories, the world itself, learning about history and trying to forget her reality. And over the next 2 years, she clung to that dream, that she would become a huntress, that she would escape this kingdom and find a way to be free. And once she turned 12 years old, she got the opportunity. Her mother had originally come from Vacuo, and upon seeing everything that was happening, she became disgusted with Mistral and the attitude that they had. They could put up with the discrimination up until that point, but it wasn't fair to treat a child this way because of something that she didn't have control over at the time. Over those 2 years, Zelena did train a little bit with her semblance, only enough to gain control over knowing how to and when to activate it, so that she could be sure never to let her emotions get out of control and never to activate her semblance again. From the day she used it on herself by accident, she never activated it on another person for fear of spreading people's hatred of her. But her mother decided that it was time for them to leave Mistral. Her father was human and accepting of Faunus, but again, people of Mistral weren't too kind to that. So instead, they decided to go to Vacuo, and in particular go to the settlement of Kakina, where there was the combat school Oscuras. It is here that Zelena would begin her training to become a huntress, and her parents supported her every step of the way, of course going so far as to move themselves along with Zelena across Remnant to Vacuo, in hopes that Zelena would be able to escape the judgment she experienced in Mistral, as in Vacuo, anyone who can survive there is welcome. And with Zelena's mother also being a native of Vacuo, she had hoped that the family would be able to adjust there a lot easier. But still, Zelena's heart had grown cold over the past 2 years of discrimination because of her semblance. From both Faunus and human alike, Zelena just gained a disliking for everyone, and that didn't change by just switching the environment. She didn't intend to make any friends when going to Oscuras. She just wanted to keep her head down, keep her semblance hidden, and focus on her studies to achieve her dream of freedom, of becoming a huntress. But unbeknownst to her, there was an encounter she was about to make. Someone that she would run into who would become a light in her darkness. A little bird away from the nest, one Seraphina Vermilion. But that story is for another time. Hopefully you all enjoyed this brief look into Zelena's character, how she grew up in Mistral, how she awakened her semblance, and her feelings as she is going to attend the combat school for the first time, and leading up to the first meeting of 2 of the members of Team Seraph. Hopefully you guys are looking forward to the stories that are yet to come over the following weeks. Before the next character of Team Seraph is introduced, there are some chapters of Team Seraph's story that need to be covered between Seraphina Vermilion and Zelena Ray. So hopefully you guys will look forward to that. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. How do you guys like Zelena's character? Do you think that she is a fitting allusion to Medusa with her semblance and her weapons and the abilities that she has? I would love to know your thoughts down in the comments below. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video, and if you did, want to see more of Team Seraph, want to see more RWBY content, make sure to subscribe, join the Guild of the Eternal Flame. Also join our Discord server if you're interested in making, your own OCs, discussing RWBY, discussing theories, Volume 8, when it's going to come out, etc. All of that happens in our Discord. Tweet me at PhoenixKnight7, and I'll see you guys in the next video.